for this panel. Louis Maia de Freitas holds a BA in Cultural Heritage and Archaeology from the University of Algarve in Portugal and an MA in Ancient History and Classical Culture from Swansea University. He is currently a first-year PhD student at Swansea University, and his whole research project is entitled Hybrid and Third Space Representations from Hellenistic-Roman Syria and Western Mesopotamia, an approach to cultural interactions and diversity in cities of the Seleucid, Parthian, and Roman empires. Over to you, Louis.
First of all, good afternoon to all the participants, and thank you very much, Steve and Samuel, for giving me this opportunity to present in my first conference ever. Hopefully more shall come, but before I start to present, let me confirm if that you are seeing the first slide, and I'm going to confirm as well if I can jump to the second one. You can just nod or say yes. Okay. Okay, so shall we begin? Let's go. So the following topic that I'm going to present is about the Euphrates River as engagement facilitator of Hellenistic-Roman cities. And I'm going to try to answer the main question of this paper: how the Euphrates engaged a diversity of different ethnicities living within cities built across its upper, middle, and lower banks. And throughout the answers, I will also answer to the sub-questions. Was Euphrates a symbolic boundary? What major crossing points and roads had existed to facilitate such engagement? And I will present the example of the city Zeugma and the case study Duraeuropa in terms of how the Euphrates linked communities at Durham and should be regarded as a reference point. So the Euphrates River is a large waterway that flows from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey and the Armenian highlands through Syria and Mesopotamia, reflected into its traditional division into upper, middle, and lower, and connects with the tributaries such as the Kabur, Balik, and eventually near the mouth of the Persian Gulf and the confluence with the Tigris. Purcell states that Euphrates occupied a geographical position of power for ancient empires, as it facilitated movement for trade, provided routes for travel, and encouraged the construction of Hellenistic and Roman cities and villages. The mobility that the river promoted led to the emergence of ethnically and culturally diverse communities and provided both a frontier and an axis for military conflict in territorial struggles between empires in the Near East. And it is exactly about this last point that I want to stress, because the Euphrates was played as a sort of political and military role of a boundary during the military campaigns of several Near Eastern empires, such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, Alexander against the Achaemenids, Seleucid occupation, and lastly, Roman and Parthian tensions. And while they were disputing it, the river was useful to expand their influence through defensive frontiers in some parts of its banks to control movement. And in this context, the Euphrates would be known as symbolic boundary, which is a term borrowed from sociology that means the establishment of a societal line that distinguishes communities through culture, ethnicity, and language. Butcher argues that despite the Euphrates was a highway for cultural interactions between communities across the river itself, it is arguably that it acted as symbolic boundary nonetheless, particularly during Roman and Parthians military tensions, since both of them wanted to expand their influence on the upper and middle Euphrates, because on one hand, Armenia was disputed by them, as it was near the Taurus Mountains where the Euphrates initially flows, streaming through there as well as Cappadocia and Commagene, and conquering it would establishing a military frontier on the mountains range to control the main passages of the Euphrates through Mesopotamia and Syria. And on the other hand, their expansion meant obtaining control of the Fertile Crescent together with the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. According to Plutarch and Appian, as you can see on these extracts, the first one mentions that the boundary was a request by Parthian king Phraates III, who was in negotiations with Pompey to establish middle ground with Rome, due to his concerns to Roman general Gabinius leading a raid across the Euphrates and towards the Tigris, which was a Roman expansion threatening Parthian influence in Mesopotamia. And this request was completely ignored by Pompey, as Appian states that the recognition of this boundary by Rome meant nothing, as throughout the centuries, Roman imperial presence has grown formally from Pompey until the ruling of Septimus Severus and his successors, occupying Syria, Mesopotamia, and other territories around the Euphrates in the Near East. And the Euphrates, in that context of Phraates' request, said to have been acted as a symbolic boundary. However, should we consider it symbolic boundary as such? Well, according to some ancient authors that I mentioned, and others such as Strabo, they rather have presented this symbolic boundary to depict Roman power east of the Euphrates, as if there was no limit on how Rome has exercised it, and that is a propagandistic symbolism where Rome's campaign on the river was fearless against the military force of the Parthians, and which would also establish a kind of social and cultural boundary where the Romans were superior to the Parthians and other ethnicities living in the Near East. And because of that, Fergus Miller stresses that this issue, as he considers that the Euphrates rather should be understood not as a symbolic boundary within these contexts that can create a social difference, but as an open passageway facilitating routes for populations to settle, create, and establish relationships. And it is from here that I shall suggest the concept of engagement facilitator for the Euphrates. This term is applied in social works where a facilitator can be regarded as a third person who engages communities through tasks where through meetings, where those interact and work together effectively through tasks that address a social problem. And the Euphrates here could be fit into this context as a catalyst or a third space where different ethnic populations were able to develop networks of commercial and cultural relations through the establishment of short and long distance trading routes across the river, allowing them to interact, share, and merge their cultures, languages, ethnic backgrounds, and eventually the foundation of cities and villages. And Cameron points out three main important routes in Mesopotamia and Syria for such mobility. The northern route, from the western side of the Euphrates through Syria, proceeding east of the edges of the Taurus Mountains and across northern Mesopotamia. And then the Euphrates route, which starts in the same side of the northern route and crossing southeast towards Babylonia. And lastly, the desert route along the middle and lower Euphrates, where Palmyrene traders and soldiers crossed the Syrian desert between Palmyra and trading outposts within cities such as Duraeuropas. And amongst those main routes and other local ones over the Euphrates, crossing points were fundamental for such mobility in the Near East, where in the Antonine itinerary, 3 crossing points over the Euphrates are mentioned: Zeugma, Samosata, Philaticomos, and also others such as Melitene, Satala, and Cape Persana. And among those, I will give the example of Zeugma for this paper, which means crossing or bridge in Greek. And it was a city founded by Seleucus Nicator in 300 or 299 BC, located west of the river to defend a bridge over the Euphrates, connecting Mesopotamia and city. And it was also known as Seleucia on the Euphrates and connected with its twin city, Apamea. According to Isidore of Charax in fragment 1 of the Parthian Stations, he narrates the Euphrates route in detail from Zeugma, since it is said to have a permanent bridge that facilitated mobility down to the middle and lower Euphrates, mentioning also in detail other cities such as Phaliga, Azish, Dayara, and also Duraeuropa that were connected along this route. And the existence of bridges at Zeugma within different contexts, Comfort states that permanent bridges were a problem since the water currents of the upper Euphrates were strong, making difficult such movement to the east. And therefore, the hypothesis of floating or pontoon bridges is mentioned. And Galikowski, through a satellite survey work about crossing points, suggests that from Hellenistic-Roman periods, pontoon bridges were used in Zeugma to cross and move to Syria and Mesopotamia to control the flow of traffic through the payment of tolls. Aylward, moreover, argues that there was no archaeological evidence referencing pontoon bridges, as only generic references by Arrian in his Anabasis, where he narrated Alexander's march to Babylon while crossing the Euphrates at Thapsacus using 2 boat bridges, and Arminius Marcellinus in his history about the construction of boat bridges at Zeugma and Cape Persana to advance towards Edessa to halt Persian Sasanian raids. But nonetheless, archaeological works in Duraeuropa indicate that mobility from Zeugma until Duraeuropa may have happened. And Heath and Chi state that traveling entertainers and prostitutes from Zeugma have traveled to Dura, where they stationed at a brothel. That brothel is known in the archaeological reports of Dura as House G5C. And according to those reports, they may have carried a hoard of bronze coins minted at Zeugma. However, this is a guess, or probably many of the reports were not published at all. But we can confirm that through Jan Baird, she reveals a series of tablets painted on the walls of that brothel that specified names of the occupants and the house functions, as well as through the letter parchment P. Dura 29, the name of Aurelius Theodorus, who was from Zeugma but resided as a citizen of Duraeuropa, who may have probably the owner of this traveling performing business. And as I proposed this potential example of Zeugma as crossing point, I now turn to the case study, Duraeuropa. It was founded as a Seleucid colony on a valley of the Middle Euphrates in the late 4th century BC, then administered later by the Parthians in the late 2nd century BC, and then by the Romans in AD 165, with a brief military interlude by Trajan in AD 116 and 17, and then by the Sasanians in AD 256 until its abandonment, the abandonment of the city in AD 363. And in its vicinity, it was surrounded by fertile land, which attracted communities to move there throughout time while crossing the Euphrates route and other ones to enter into the city through the Palmyra gate in its west wall. Moving on to the lifestyle of Dura, Ted Kaiser states that Duraeuropa constituted a large community involving diverse groups of different languages and cultures. That is, as you see here through these images depicting inscriptions and a relief sculpture, there was, in Dura, they spoke Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Middle Persian, Parthian, Safaetic, which is an Arabian dialect, and Semitic, namely Aramaic, Hattian, Syriac, and Palmyrenian. And whilst you see these images, they were attested in inscriptions, graffiti, papyri, wall paintings, ceramics, and art and architecture that attest the linguistic variety of Dura's urban identity. In the synagogue of Dura, Aramaic, Greek, and Middle Persian, as you can see on this one, inscription that was found at the synagogue, Middle Persian dialectal languages were identified on these inscriptions and graffiti, apart from the Hebrew liturgical text. And beyond the synagogue, the group of temples with Greek and Semitic names and the Durine houses also show inscriptions and graffiti, as well as other material culture such as sculptures, pottery, or frescoes, combined with Greco-Roman and Eastern artistic styles, making them markers of the variety and eventually the mixture of ethnicities. Pollard argues that the languages spoken in Dura had a context, whether it was military, civic, and religious. In military contexts, Latin was the formal language for the administration of the army. Greek was perhaps used for the recruitment of soldiers who were Syriac or Aramaic, since they also could speak Greek as well. And also Palmyrene, as the Palmyrene troops, such as the cohort's 20th Palmyrenorum, garrisoned at Dura under Roman control, could also speak Semitic, and also they traveled across the Syrian desert and across Euphrates, so they knew very well the Near East. In civilian contexts, Greek seemed to be the main language, while Aramaic and Syriac were probably used as a colloquial dialect. And in religion, they mostly, or even all of the spoken languages in Dura were spoken and appeared in pagan cults. And we can also observe Greek and combined with Semitic and Palmyrene names, syncretized in the range of temples that were built during the Parthian rule, such as the temple of Zeus Soter or temple of Bel, Zeus Kyrios Baal Shamin, and Artemis Asenatkona. And within this brief text of Duraeuropa's linguistic wealth through archaeological and literary evidence, we can say that Dura is acknowledged as a hybrid city due to the cultural and linguistic diversity that lived there. And it is very likely that the Euphrates River was the referencing point for such community engagement, because on one hand, Dura was connected to the desert route, the Euphrates route, and other local itineraries where soldiers, merchants, travelers, and ordinary people circulated onto them across the river to settle, make commerce, and live. The crossing point at Zeugma, and certainly other ones, has established between the Hellenistic, Parthian, and Roman periods during military disputations, as well as other local routes in Syria and Mesopotamia that have helped to grow such mobility network and subsequent engagement. And on the other hand, Dura was a cosmopolitan city, and the archaeological and literary evidence show the diversity of people speaking different languages and having different cultures that lived in community, thanks to not only the arable land that existed around the vicinity, but also the existence of Semitic and Palmyrene soldiers recruited into the Roman army that were able to speak Greek and their mother tongue. We have, sorry, there's a weird sound coming on. And for concluding remarks, the Euphrates River, to some extent, was used as a symbolic boundary, where Armenia was part of the tensions between Parthians and Romans, and where ancient authors considered as a Parthian defeat. But nonetheless, I suggest looking at the Euphrates, not in that context, but as a waterway that led people to transgress that boundary, to move and live in the Near East, allowing them to interact and merge their cultures and languages in cities and villages when they were able to engage as communities, as Duraeuropa's demonstrated. So I thank you very much for the paper presentation, and alongside with the open questions, I would also like to suggest this one: what other crossing points existed on the Euphrates River which facilitated community engagement in other Syrian and Mesopotamian cities? I've mentioned a few, Samosata and Metilene, but there were also other crossing points, very certainly. Thank you very much.